Welcome to UkraineWorld and its podcast Explaining Ukraine. Today I'm going to talk with you about the causes of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the three major causes as I see it. The first is the question of identity. The second is a question of political values and politics in more general terms. And the third is the question of ethics, the ethical reasons. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and chief editor of UkraineWorld. And these are my short explaining videos trying to give to you a more context about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, about the Ukrainian culture, about the Ukrainian history and present, and I hope future. Now, I'm talking with you about these three causes. And the first one for me is the identity cause, the identity issue. Why I'm stressing this? Because in all the Russian discourse, it is clear, we see it very clearly, and I would say even psychoanalytically clearly, that for Russians it's very painful to see that Ukrainians identify themselves as Ukrainians, that Ukrainians are not identifying themselves as Russians. And for Russian political myth, Ukraine, and in particular Kyiv, plays a major role. So for them, and they are trying to prove to themselves and to Ukrainians that actually Ukraine has never existed, that Kyiv, as the capital of today's Ukraine, has been a Russian city and it's a kind of a birthplace of Russia as it is. So it's a kind of a traumatic for them to see the birthplace, the place that they consider as a birthplace of Russia, be in kind of another country, another identity. But the problem is that, of course, for them, the question of this Russian identity goes way, way to the deep medieval times and to Middle Ages, to the time where there was a powerful state, medieval state called Rus, not Russia, but Rus. Rus has most probably the Scandinavian origin, Finnish or Swedish origin. It's a very complicated medieval history, and Kyiv was the center of this state. And if we talk about today's Russia has existed probably since Peter I, so since the Russian Empire. That's the moment when the very concept of the Russian Empire has been born. Before that, you could certainly not talk about Russia in the modern sense of the term, but the Russian political ideology tries to really to extend this identity back to medieval times and to say, okay, where Kyiv was, there was Russia, and it was not Ukraine, it was us. Of course, it is wrong, because it would be the same as to say, for example, that Carolingian Empire of Carolus Magnus was actually a German state or a French state or Italian state or whatever else. And Russians are playing on this, but this is this attempt to work with the past, rather with the present and with the future, to say that okay, this is a nation which is not existing. We will conquer this nation back. We will exterminate the very identity which says it is not Russia. It is all very painful play with its own identity, with its own past. And the problem for Russians, as I see it, is that they find it deeply problematic to understand what Russia is. They find it deeply problematic to understand that Russia can exist without Kyiv, for example. And they try to capture Kyiv, to bring Ukraine back, in order to prove to themselves that Russia still exists, that Russia in their minds and as they imagine it still exists. So their propaganda is saying that Ukrainians are not existing, that it's an artificial nation, while the problem is that their own perception of themselves is very problematic, and they themselves cannot really imagine Russia without Kyiv and without Ukraine. And this makes, of course, the relations very, very complicated, because on the one hand, you see that Russia tries to recolonize Ukraine and to bring back the old imperial politics and very cruel imperial politics, with killing a lot of people, with attacking civilians and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, we see that, Ukraine for them, as if they consider Ukraine for themselves as their own origin, and they try to bring this own origin back. And of course, this creates the whole situation around Russian colonialism much more complicated, much more paradoxical. The second reason, the second cause, is a political cause, and here I mean primarily political values. So Russian history, if we take Peter the First, if we take even earlier times, Ivan the Terrible, if we take Peter the First, if we take Catherine II, if we take Russian Empire of the 19th century, very repressive with the huge repressive machine, and Ukrainians and other nations know that very well. If we take Soviet Union, we understand that the democratic or republican model didn't work. Russians actually never really tried it. So they tried it probably in the medieval times, not Russians, but Novgorodians, for example, or Novgorod as a city-state. It didn't work. And since the Mongol invasion and the development of the Muscovy, we see these very authoritarian trends. We see the idea that you can build politics only on the hierarchy and violence. And we see that Peter I did this thing. We see that Catherine II were basing her politics upon violence and conquest and everything. We see, of course, the Soviet Union doing that. We see some exceptions like the Decembrist revolt in early 19th century, some other rebellions. But it's paradoxical that, for example, even if we take Russian Bolshevism, Russian communism, which is supposed to be an egalitarian ideology, which destroys hierarchy, which destroys inequality, whatever. Even if we go to the minds and imagination of the Russian communist ideologists of the late 19th century, from which the Russian Bolsheviks were born, you will see very clear authoritarian trend. You will see very clear idea that, okay, we are making the revolution in order to put the good Tsar, the good sovereign, instead of the bad one. And we will keep the existing hierarchy, we'll kind of change it a little bit, but the hierarchy is very important. And here comes this concept of the dictatorship of proletariat, which was very important for Lenin and for Bolsheviks and then for Stalin, etc. So basically, Russian communism was not at all communism. It was a very strict hierarchy based on violence, which used the communist ideology as a kind of a shirm, as a kind of a mask. And here comes the Ukrainian political history, which has a clear democratic or republican element in it. Since the medieval times, since Kiev and Rus around Kiev, which was very much fragmented as any medieval feudal state at the time, which was kind of a pluralistic and in which power was dispersed between different city-states. You can, of course, talk about the Ukrainian Cossacks of early modern age, who had a very powerful republican or democratic, depends how you call it, political culture, anti-tyrannical political culture. The idea that, yes, we will probably have a sovereign to whom we would be accountable to, a king, sometimes even an emperor, Rudolf II, most often the king, but we will not obey anyone else. So this a little bit anarchic idea was among Ukrainian Cossacks, Zaporozhian Cossacks. And of course, the 19th century, if you look at political philosophy of Ukraine in the 19th century, it's all based upon democratic ideas, primarily people like Drahomanov or even people like Kostomarov and many others. And therefore, for example, Ukrainian independence in early 20th century, which was practically not noticed by anybody outside of Ukraine, and therefore it failed. It was very much in these ideas. It was also an attempt to build a socialist republic, but socialist not in the sense of the Russian Marxists, but in the sense of a cooperative movements working together, very decentralized idea, etc. Maybe this is why it failed, because it lacked the idea of power. So it has another deficiency, lack of hierarchy. So Russian idea, political idea, was based upon the idea that hierarchy means everything, and Ukrainian, rather than we are very mistrustful to hierarchy, we're rather basing ourselves on decentralization, on communities, etc., grassroots movements. And here you can see a clear pattern here in this war. So Russian machine is very centralized, a very hierarchical, and Ukraine, which defends itself, of course, with its own hierarchy, state hierarchy, because otherwise it would not be possible to defend itself, but also this element, democratic, even a little bit anarchic element, decentralized element, is also played a very, very big role. And why I'm stressing this? Because Russia is really afraid that this spirit of democracy, the spirit of republic or anti-tyrannical politics, politics that is based upon the initiatives of the people and plurality of power, rather than the strong hierarchy and violence, Russians are very afraid that it will penetrate Russia. Because maybe they are right in this, because if this idea penetrates Russia, Russia's empire is gone. Russia can no longer exist as an empire in its current form. And therefore they are very afraid of it. They're very afraid of these values of freedom, republic, respublika, meaning the idea that politics is a matter of all and not just a matter of decisions of the Tsar. They are very afraid that these values will come to the Russian state and will destroy it. And of course, there is another political reason, is that Russia really perceives that the collapse of the Soviet Union was evil, was the act of evil, and therefore Putin's put it very clearly, and that it was the defeat of Russian Empire against the West, and that the West has won this war, this Cold War, and this defeat in the Cold War needs to be revenged, and therefore Russia is actually accumulating its resources since the start of the Putin's reign to achieve revenge against the so-called West. And this is also very important. This element is very important for us to understand. We have the air alert, and I started this video during the air alert, so we have this now, the cancelled air alert. We have air alerts every day. So I'm writing this video from Kiev suburb. So it's a very typical story for us. Now, what is important? It's important that this idea that you need to take revenge for this for this defeat in the Cold War is very present in Russia. We will probably talk about this in one of our next episodes. Contrary to this, for example, for Ukrainians, the collapse of the Soviet Union is mostly perceived as a good thing, as a thing that liberated the potential, the national, the cultural, the economic potential of Ukraine. So this difference in political values is very important. Russia, there is no alternative Russian political project so far. There is no tradition of Russian liberalism. There is no tradition. There is no big tradition of Russian liberalism, Russian democratic thinking. Unfortunately, we have rather in the 19th century we have the dispute between groups of intellectuals who were rather reflecting upon which model of authoritarian rule, whether the model oriented to the West, to the secularism, or the model oriented to the roots of Orthodox culture are better for Russia. But we don't really have a Russian liberal tradition, contrary to Ukraine, and therefore Ukrainians have a certain pantheon of authors to base their action upon. They have Taras Shevchenko, they have Mikhail Drahomanov, they have Lesya Ukrainka, they have this generation of the modernists, they have the generation of the 1920s, etc., while Russians do not have it. And this is a problem, because if we think about whether Russia can be democratic in the future, Russians should build this alternative idea of Russia, this alternative idea, not imperial Russia, not centralized Russia, democratic Russia, smaller territory, etc. And the third factor, the third cause of this war, I'm calling it ethical, because I think that this is a very important element. And for me, the key thing, the core of it is the question of violence. Because for me, personally, well, of course, there are wars are happening, but the question is why Russians are so cruel. Why Russians are cruel in a situation when you can avoid cruelty. Why, for example, they really shoot at the evacuation cars, knowing that there are children inside, knowing that there are women inside. Why they put hundreds of people into the basement of a school and keep them for 1 month, 300 something people, like it happened in Yahidne in Chernihiv Oblast, while they drop aviation bombs which kill everybody in the building on the residential buildings. And all these questions are, of course, very tough questions, very important questions. And for me, you cannot really respond to them with the questions of politics or geopolitics or even identity. You can only respond to them with a moral question, with the question, what is happening in the Russian society? What is happening with Russians' ordinary lives? Why they project this violence outside? And my response is that violence is so present in the Russian society on every level, on domestic level, on bureaucratic level. So you are a worker, you're a family member, whatever else, and you're subject to this violence, physical violence, moral violence, etc. This degrading treatment of you, this idea that you're only in the hierarchy and you can be either a master or you can be a victim. And I do think that many Russians who come here to Ukraine, they actually are subject to this violence inside their country. And therefore, they try to show to themselves and to others that they're not only victims of violence, but the only option to show that is to commit violence themselves. If I'm suffering from violence and degrading treatment and I lost my dignity, my only response, and I don't know anything else, my only response would be to commit violence on others, so that I tell myself that I'm not weak and I'm able to commit violence. And this valorization of violence is this idea that violence is the argument of last resort. I do think that this is something that so much is present in the Russian society on the everyday level, that of course, it goes to the practice of these soldiers. Because it's not Putin who's doing that. It's the decisions of these particular soldiers, of these rank and file Russian soldiers who commit these crimes. And they commit it to show that they're not just a small person. They're not just an entity which is not important to anybody. They are important. They have power, and therefore power for them equals violence. So they can commit this violence to prove that they have power. And why they're trying to prove that they have power? Because they were told in multiple situations in their lives that they have not any value at all, that they have no value at all. And I do think that we need to reflect upon it. And frankly speaking, what bothers me, what worries me very much, is that this virus, the idea of violence as an argument of the last resort, as the only argument, is spreading in today's world. So violence is getting more and more popular, and cruelty is getting more and more popular. Cruelty of speech, cruelty of jokes, cruelty of political discourse, cruelty of cynicism. And here, I mean, we should be very, very worried and very, very attentive to this, because if it spreads up to the moment, then we cannot stop it. Then these wars will, of course, spread. So our experience, the experience of Ukrainians, really should be looked at very, very attentively. And this is why it is so important to support Ukraine in this war. because it's not only the war for Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian sovereignty, Ukrainian democracy, it's also the war for values. And values here, I don't only mean these abstract wars like democratic values or whatever. I mean that we should stop this virus of violence, which is now coming from Russia for various reasons, but which is also present around the world, which says that violence is the only means for you to keep power, or the only means to have your wishes come true, or whatever else. And here we have the opposite, absolutely opposite value systems. One value system which says that violence is the king. The other value system which says, no, we can actually solve problems together without violence, just with conversation, with mutual help, with mutual care, with understanding of each other experience. And I'm very worried that this violence-based value system is winning gradually all over the world. And if Ukraine fails in this war, it will certainly win all over the world. All other dictators, all other tyrants around the world will say, okay, if Putin is okay with his violence, then they will do this. Then we will do the same. We will commit this similar violence. This worries me a lot. I will finish on that, and thank you for watching, and thank you for your comments. What do you think about it? My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and chief editor of UkraineWorld. We're trying to make Ukraine better understood around the world. And thank you for watching us. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can find this link in the description of this episode. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.